We've had multiple noise complaints tonight.
I've been here with my kids. It's quiet in here.
Ma'am, don't argue with me. We need to make sure everything's okay. Step back from the door.
We need to make sure everything's okay.
You do not have permission to enter my house. I'm telling you. Step back right now. You're being uncooperative.
The chime of the doorbell at 7:32 p.m. was a stone dropped into the deep, still pond of Judge Rebecca Lawson's evening. In the sanctuary of her villa, the ripples it created were not of sound, but of a coming chaos, a fissure in the established order. She was immersed in an appellate brief concerning the abuse of the Fourth Amendment, her pen hovering over a single word, curtilage. The sacred, invisible boundary the law draws around a private life, a fortress extending from the front porch to the garden's edge. She was contemplating the extent to which that line could, or should, hold against the prying eyes of the state, whether those eyes belonged to a drone, a high-powered telescope, or an officer acting on a flimsy pretext of reasonable suspicion. She never imagined the most brutal violation of that boundary would come not from high-tech surveillance or a labyrinthine legal statute, but from two people in uniform, armed with the most primitive of prejudices. This house was her fortress, but it was also her temple. Every book, every piece of art, was an extension of her intellect and her aesthetic. Her husband was in Chicago at an architectural conference on urban sustainability. Her children were chasing their own dreams in their own cities. Tonight, it was just her and Bach's cello suites, the music's rigorous logic a parallel to the law she revered, weaving harmony from a world of chaos. The doorbell was the first discordant note, a string snapping under a malicious thumb. She removed her reading glasses and walked to the door. The peephole, that ancient watchtower of domestic defense, revealed a stark tableau. Two cops. The older one, Sergeant David Kane, was in his 40s, built like a man who had spent his life imposing his will. The silver at his temples did nothing to soften the assessing, critical glint in his eyes. He held a clipboard like a crude scepter, a flimsy prop for the authority he was about to exert. The younger officer, Lisa Rodriguez, wore her hair in a severe bun. Her eyes darted, carrying the nervous energy of a rookie predator, eager to prove herself, to earn her place in a world of men and their unspoken codes. The moment they stepped onto her porch, Sergeant Kane's internal monologue had already convicted her. He'd been driving through this affluent neighborhood for weeks, and this house had snagged his attention, not for its grandeur, but for what it represented, a dislocation. In his worldview, a constructive experience, bias, and a resentment passed down through generations. A house like this belonged to a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller, or at the very least, a white man whose success he could comprehend. But for weeks, all he had seen was a black woman, coming and going alone. The visual dissonance festered in him, blooming into a nameless rage. It wasn't simple racism. It was a deeper, more primal fear of a world turned upside down. He saw himself as a guardian of order, and Rebecca Lawson's very existence was a form of disorder. He wasn't here about a noise complaint. He was here to correct an error. Rebecca slid the brass security chain into place. That thin link of metal, the final, fragile covenant of a civil society. She opened the door a crack. "Good evening, officers. Can I help you?" Her voice was calm, articulate, tinged with the interrogative precision of a judge. It was neither deferential nor defiant. Sergeant Kane recited his identity by rote, claiming they'd received multiple complaints from neighbors about noise. The lie was flimsy, amateurish. Rebecca knew this community intimately. Its bonds were forged in a shared respect for privacy. Noise. The Bach was playing in her soundproof study at a volume meant for her ears alone. It was a pathetic pretext, a crowbar to pry open a lock. "I think there must be some mistake, officer," she stated coolly. "It's been perfectly quiet here all evening. If you could tell me which neighbor complained, perhaps I could speak with them directly." Kane's gaze didn't meet hers. It shot past her, through the crack in the door, greedily inventorying the foyer, the Jacob Lawrence print on the wall, the sweep of the curved staircase, the warm glow from the distant study. His was not the objective gaze of an investigator, but the calculating eye of an appraiser, as if he were assessing the property's value and weighing whether its owner was a match. He didn't see a home. He saw a crime scene, where a black woman had stolen a life that wasn't meant for her. "We can't disclose complainant information," he said flatly, taking a half step forward, his physical presence a palpable pressure against the door. "We have the right address, ma'am. We need to come inside and investigate." A cold dread seized her. This wasn't law enforcement. It was the prelude to an invasion. 15 years on the bench had taught her every nuance of due process. She could smell the danger when power slipped its procedural leash. She made a decision, one that would escalate this simmering confrontation into a storm. "Please wait a moment," she said, her tone still measured. "I'd like to call my neighbor to verify this. It's important to me." The reasonable request was the spark that ignited Kane's fury. His patience evaporated. The professional mask shattered, revealing the raw hostility beneath. "That won't be necessary," he boomed, his voice tearing through the night's quiet. "We need to come in now. Do you have a warrant?" Rebecca's voice was not loud, but each word landed with the weight of a gavel on oak. That question, the ultimate challenge of law to power, demolished the last vestiges of his feigned legitimacy. His face flushed a deep, mottled red, not with shame, but with the rage of being challenged. He, a man accustomed to absolute obedience on the streets, was being held at bay by a door chain and a clause from the Constitution. "We don't need a warrant for a noise complaint. If you don't cooperate, you're obstructing an investigation," he roared, jamming his heavy, boot-clad foot into the opening. "Remove your foot," Rebecca commanded. "You are illegally entering my home." His answer was the sickening crack of splintering wood as he threw his shoulder into the door. The brass chain twisted and snapped with a pathetic shriek. Kane and Rodriguez stumbled into her foyer, bringing with them the chaotic, feral energy of the street, instantly polluting her sanctuary. They were oblivious to the silent, watching eyes. Cameras, discreetly installed in the corners of the ceiling, on bookshelves, and among the foyer's decor, were the tireless scribes of this moment, faithfully recording the brutal trampling of civility in cold, digital code. "ID," Kane barked, as if he were the master of the house. "In my own home, for a noise complaint that never happened, you need to see my ID?" Rebecca countered, her composure a mirror reflecting the sheer absurdity of his aggression. "You're acting suspicious." Kane spat the words. And there it was, the rotten core of the entire encounter. He wasn't suspicious of her actions. He was suspicious of her existence. A black woman in a house that, in the rigid geography of his mind, she had no right to occupy. That mismatch was the original sin. Rebecca didn't argue further. She calmly retrieved her driver's license from her purse. The address printed on it matched the number on her front door, a direct refutation of Kane's entire prejudiced premise. He stared at it for a long moment, the silence thick with his frustration, his bruised ego, the fury of being proven wrong. Then he asked the decisive question, a question that had nothing to do with noise. "What do you do for a living?" "I am a judge." The air in the foyer seemed to crystallize. Time stretched. Kane's pupils contracted. Rodriguez took an involuntary step back, her heel bumping against a console table. The expressions on their faces were a rapid, chaotic transition from predator to prey: shock, disbelief, and a flicker of raw fear. But Kane, a man who had built his identity on a simple, brutal hierarchy, refused to accept this inversion of power. In his world, the power of the street was his. The power of the court was distant, abstract. He could not tolerate a black woman holding a dual advantage over him: the wealth of this house and the authority of the bench. It was an existential threat to his entire belief system. So he did the most foolish, most instinctive thing. He denied reality and doubled down. "I don't believe you," he sneered, using contempt to mask his panic. "Where's your credentials? Let's see your judicial ID." While he spoke, Rodriguez began to wander into the living room. It wasn't a search, it was a symbolic occupation. Her fingers grazed the lacquered surface of the grand piano. She picked up a family photo and set it down. Her movements were a flagrant desecration of this private space. Rebecca's patience finally broke. She walked to her study and returned with her judicial identification and a business card. When the state court seal and the words, "The Honorable Rebecca Lawson, Circuit Court Judge," came into view, Kane's last defense crumbled. But he didn't apologize. He didn't retreat. A long career of abusing his power had atrophied his ability to self-correct. To back down now would be to admit his prejudice was wrong, that his entire worldview was a pathetic joke. He made a ruinous decision. He would bury his initial mistake under a bigger one. "These could be fake," he announced, his voice strained with the effort of his own bravado. "You need to come with us to the station to verify your identity. This is unlawful detention." For the first time, Rebecca's voice carried the full, unyielding authority of her courtroom. "I am ordering you to leave my home immediately. I am calling the chief of police and my attorney right now." "No," "You're not going anywhere," Kane said, unclipping his handcuffs. The metallic rattle was obscene in the quiet room. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." With Rodriguez's help, the cold steel clamped around Rebecca's wrists. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of being stripped bare. The cuffs bound more than her hands. They bound her identity, her dignity, the entire legal order she represented. She remembered what her father told her on the day she graduated from law school. "Baby girl, remember this. That robe can protect you, but it's still just cloth. To some people, you'll always be a black woman first and a judge second." The cold, biting metal gave his words a terrible, physical weight. She was marched out of her home into a surrealist nightmare of her neighbors, shocked faces, and the flash of cell phone cameras. She saw Mr. Chin across the street, shaking his head. She saw Mrs. Henderson next door, her hand covering her mouth. Their eyes held not condemnation, but fear. If this could happen to Judge Lawson, what chance did any of them have? Kane's actions hadn't just violated one citizen. They had punched a black hole in the community's trust in public authority. The scene at the police station was a dark, farcical drama of collapsing power structures. The desk sergeant, Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran, went pale when he saw Rebecca. He had testified in her court dozens of times and knew her reputation for being tough but scrupulously fair. He looked at Kane with a kind of horrified disbelief, as if he were looking at a madman who had just detonated a bomb in their own headquarters. Within 30 minutes, the station lobby was more solemn than any courtroom. The chief of police, the mayor, and the district attorney arrived, their faces a mixture of panic, fury, and despair. Chief Williams's apologies felt cheap and hollow against the raw, red marks on Rebecca's wrists. The real bomb dropped when Rebecca revealed she had been quietly investigating misconduct within the department. Kane's name was on her list. And when Chief Williams could find no record of any noise complaint from that night, the truth struck everyone like lightning. This wasn't a mistake. This was a premeditated, racially motivated hunt targeting a federal judge. The FBI's involvement was a scalpel, slicing through the department's seemingly healthy skin to reveal the rot and infection festering beneath. On Kane's computer, they found a file he had ironically labeled the Community Purification Initiative. It contained detailed dossiers on over 60 successful African Americans, doctors, lawyers, professors, entrepreneurs. Their only crime was their success. Kane and a small cadre of like-minded officers were a pack of hyenas, systematically harassing, intimidating, and falsely accusing them. Their motive wasn't just racial hatred. It was a more complex, insidious psychology, a terror of social mobility, a twisted sense of themselves as protectors of a natural order. In their zero-sum worldview, the success of these black professionals was an aberration, a theft of resources and status that rightfully belonged to white people. Every traffic stop, every baseless accusation, was a desperate attempt to set their world right again. A recovered text from Kane's phone laid it bare. "Made that black doctor in the Porsche miss his surgery today. Loved watching him squirm. Gotta remind them who's really in charge here." The trial was a public autopsy of the city. Lead prosecutor Amanda Sterling, a woman known for her surgical precision, turned the proceedings into a masterclass on systemic corruption. Kane's defense tried to paint him as a dedicated, if overzealous, officer, while subtly suggesting Rebecca's arrogance and failure to cooperate had escalated the situation, a classic victim-blaming strategy. But Sterling obliterated their narrative with the footage from Rebecca's home. The stark contrast between the judge's calm restraint and Kane's escalating aggression was undeniable. When the jury heard Kane sneer, "I don't believe you," and "these could be fake," a wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. The testimony of a Dr. Franklin brought audible sobs from the gallery. He described being pulled over by Kane and detained on the roadside for 45 minutes for matching the description of a robbery suspect's vehicle, while he was rushing to the hospital to perform emergency surgery on a child injured in a car crash. The child, he explained, missed the critical window for treatment and was left with a permanent disability. Looking directly at Kane, Dr. Franklin said, his voice trembling, "You didn't just take my time. You took that child's future." Facing a long sentence, Rodriguez turned on her partner. In a proffer session with the prosecution, she broke down, describing the toxic brotherhood culture where new officers were pressured to participate in the veterans' games to be accepted. These games included baseless stops of minorities, embellishing reports, and making arrests on flimsy evidence. She admitted she had questioned Kane's methods on her first ride along, only to be met with a week of silent treatment and ridicule. She was afraid of losing her job, of being labeled soft or disloyal. Her testimony exposed the most terrifying aspect of a corrupt system. It doesn't require a legion of monsters, only the pressure, inducements, and punishments that slowly transform ordinary people into silent accomplices and, eventually, active participants in evil. The sentences were severe: 22 years for Kane, 8 for Rodriguez, with the rest of their circle also facing prison time. Justice, it seemed, had triumphed. The media called it a landmark victory, a reaffirmation of the rule of law. After the verdict, Rebecca stood on the courthouse steps, engulfed by a sea of cameras and supporters. She delivered a powerful, measured speech, but her heart was anything but calm. She had won, but she had lost something irreplaceable: the simple, unshakable faith in the sanctity of her own home, and a measure of trust in the very legal system she served. Kane and Rodriguez were just tumors, symptoms of a deeper disease. And while you can excise a tumor, changing the toxic environment that allowed it to grow, the biases embedded in culture and institutions, was a far more difficult battle. The case did spark reform. New legislation was passed, and a civilian oversight board was established. But Rebecca knew that true change happens in the human heart, the one jurisdiction the law can barely reach. In the year that followed, she received anonymous death threats. Her house was vandalized with racist graffiti. Police union supporters online painted her as a villain who used her status to persecute a dedicated officer. She had won a legal war, only to find herself embroiled in a perpetual culture war. Years later, long retired and dedicated to nonprofit work and judicial reform, she was in her study sorting through old files. It was a quiet evening. The doorbell rang. In an instant, her heart ceased. Her body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. Intellectually, she knew it was probably a delivery driver or a neighbor's kid. But the memory of that night was a form of PTSD, reactivated by that simple chime. The shattered door, the snapped chain, the cold steel of the cuffs, they were a wound in her subconscious that would never fully heal. She had defeated 2 corrupt cops. She had shaken a sclerotic system to its core. But she knew, with a certainty that ached, that she had forever lost one small, precious thing: the ability to hear her own doorbell ring with a feeling of untroubled peace. She walked to the door, bypassing the peephole and switching on the intercom camera. On the screen, a young man with a pizza box and a sunny smile stood on her porch. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But deep inside, a voice whispered, "The fight is never over." Kane was in prison, but the soil that grows men like Kane remained fertile. As long as the phantom of a natural order based on race, class, or creed haunted the American psyche, as long as anyone believed they had the right to correct the lives of others, this battle would be fought again and again, in different forms, in different places. Her life's work, from the bench to her activism, was to ensure that the next time that bell rang for someone else, there would be more people ready to question, more people ready to resist, more people ready to hold the shield of the law firmly in their own hands. Because she knew better than anyone that the sacred boundary of curtilage is never truly guarded by doors and locks. It is guarded by the unyielding vigilance of its citizens, by their uncompromising resistance, and by an eternal suspicion of the darkness that can reside within the human heart. Justice was not a destination. It was a perpetual struggle, a long war demanding that each generation take its place on the line.